Good morning. I'm Kim Heath. I'm the Senior Retail Insight Manager here at AHDB, and welcome to the second webinar from the Retail and Consumer Insight team. Hopefully you all dialed into the first webinar, which is available online if you didn't, which looked at the impact of the cost of living crisis on meat and dairy demand and consumer behaviour. This webinar builds on that to look at the impact on consumer attitudes and trust towards the industry, deep diving into hot topics such as health, environment, animal welfare, which we all know have increased in importance over the years, but obviously now with a very different backdrop with the current economic situation. And if you're new to the AHDB Retail and Consumer Insight team, hopefully these webinars demonstrate the type of data and insight the team work on to inform and support levy payers, ultimately being the voice of the consumer. Before we start, I just want to cover some housekeeping points. We'll aim to finish before 11:30 with the agenda being 45 minutes from us and then approximately 10 minutes for Q&A. All participants will be on mute throughout, but questions can be asked by typing into the questions box, which you'll be able to find on the right-hand side. If you can't see it, there should be an orange arrow to expand the taskbar and then a white arrow to open the question box where you can type them in. And please feel free to do this during the presentation. The session is being recorded and will be hosted on our website in case you want to play it back or you want to pass on the recording to anyone. A copy of the presentation slides will be available for all participants after the session once they've filled in a quick 2-minute feedback survey. So it's really important to fill this in if you want a PDF version of the presentation. So this would be a good time to introduce our speakers for today. So we have Susie Stannard, who is the Consumer Insight Manager within the team, who will take you through the many changes we're seeing in the reputational landscape. We have Cathy Burton, our Trainee Analyst, who is going to complement this with a deep dive into health. And then we'll hand over to Kerry McDermott, who is the Head of Marketing here at AHDB. And she is going to showcase how insights help shape some great AHDB reputational campaigns. And she'll highlight how the industry can get involved. And then this will lead into the Q&A. So I will now hand over to Susie, who will start today's presentation.
Thanks very much, Kim. The reputation of farming and of meat and dairy is a key piece of equity that our industry has. It helps to drive public trust and to influence what consumers will buy. So issues such as health, the environment and animal welfare have been absolutely critical factors in recent years, as Kim said. However, the cost of living crisis is a lens through which attitudes to all other factors can be modified. In our webinars last week, we looked at how economic pressures have impacted on sales of meat and dairy. Great session, so really go back and watch if you missed it. Today, we'll be looking and exploring how this severe economic mess is impacting on trust in the industry. So I think it's fair to say, looking at shopper confidence, that it remains critically low. It's pretty much been in freefall since April last year. While there was a glimmer of hope as we enjoyed the sunshine in the summer, since then things have only become more unremittingly grim, and we're at pretty much the lowest levels since IGD have been tracking this measure. So one of the things that we track with our partner agency Blue Marble when we look at this trust study is looking at macro issues of concern that consumers might have, so across the kind of broad spectrum of societal level concerns. So this slide looks at the macro concerns, and here we're looking at change from last year. So things that have gone up, which are positives, have grown, and things which have gone down are less kind of top of mind. So the big emerging trend this year was war in Ukraine, which is a comparatively new development. So that's a new code that was added, and you can see that that's gone from nobody concerned about that to 41%. But along with that, and partially fueled by the war itself, of course, is the rising costs of both energy and food and concerns around the UK economy generally. So those have both all gone up a huge amount. Falling away in terms of issues of concern are COVID. So while COVID has been the dominating issue of concern for the past couple of years, that's become much less prevalent in what people are thinking about. And there's a whole host of issues that are really unchanged in levels of concern. So the environment, that was a huge area of concern last year and had grown to kind of displace COVID, is still a huge area of concern. It's just that other factors have kind of ballooned spectacularly and overtaken those. And particularly and it's going to be a key theme of this webinar, is that affordability of food has become at the kind of forefront of things that people are thinking about. So the price rises that people have seen in retail have been very visible, so 9 in 10 have noticed. I'm not quite sure who the 1 in 10 are who haven't noticed prices going up, but they must be out there. But value for money has become more important as a driver very generally. And when value for money rises, generally other priorities have to be sacrificed. So Cathy, my colleague, is now going to talk you through what's happened to our attitudes towards health and to what extent consumers are going to be forced to make compromises as a result.
Hi, thank you, Susie. As Susie said, I'm Cathy, and I'll be talking through how the cost of living crisis is affecting consumers' attitudes to health. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide, Susie? There we go. Thanks. So here we can see the percentage of food and drink servings chosen for health tracked over time. When the COVID pandemic hit, there was a significant drop-off in servings chosen for health as people's priorities shifted to other need states. You can see that since we came out of lockdown restrictions, food servings chosen for health steadily increased, but have not reached those pre-pandemic levels. And over the past 12 months, they've remained relatively the same. Next slide, please. There are 3 groups of needs that we look at when people consume food. Practicality and enjoyment are generally prioritised over health. There are multiple layers of needs, and consumers are always looking to satisfy more than one element. And that is why the figures across the top of the slide don't add up to 100%, as respondents can choose more than one. During COVID restrictions, we saw practicality drop off as a priority for consumers as we spent more time at home. This has just recovered to pre-pandemic levels. Enjoyment has continued to be the main element when choosing food and drink, with 79% of servings chosen with this in mind. As you can see, this has remained relatively steady throughout 2022. Next slide, please. Health is a considerable market. Just over a quarter of food choices are made for health reasons, and the value of the health market was £25.98 billion for the 52 weeks ending the 7th of August. Next slide, please. So we can divide consumers' health priorities into 2 categories. Benefit-led health is when people make positive health choices which aim to improve overall well-being, such as getting those 5 portions of fruit or veg a day. Managed health is more controlling and can be defined as those direct actions made to improve health, such as calorie control or choosing foods specifically low in fat, salt, or sugar. And you can see that during that first lockdown period, all health need states quickly went into decline year on year. As we moved out of COVID restrictions, we had a more positive outlook on health. But as time went on, our intentions moved towards managing our excesses. We are now starting to see a period again where both managed health and benefit-led health are becoming a reduced priority again, like during COVID. Possibly driven by the cost of living crisis, but could also be a reflection of the hot summer months we had. Next slide, please. This chart provides a closer look at the drivers of health. The health priorities that managed health and positive health represent drive many of the choices consumers make on a daily basis. At the top end, we see positive health priorities make up most food and drink choices, with health benefits and less processed food and drink being the most important. Next slide, please. Here we can see why consumers choose the meals they cook on a regular basis. People choose their everyday meals out of habit, for their familiarity factor, because they are their favourite to eat, and with that practicality in mind. Whilst these need states still rule, there is that underlying desire to provide balanced meals, with 79% of respondents stating so. We have seen cost creep up in importance since May 2022, but this does not outweigh other need states just yet. And as mentioned in webinar 1, whilst consumers are making changes to their purchases like trading down tiers and going to different stores to save money, they are still ending up making the same dishes as before. So you might choose to make a spaghetti bolognese that uses lentils or pork mince, which is slightly cheaper. Next slide, please. The data on this slide is from the Kantar Link Q survey on financial concerns and provides insight on those who are currently struggling, managing, or comfortable with their finances, and how this is affecting their buying behaviour when it comes to health. On the chart on the left, we can see that those who are comfortable financially score the highest for health, whilst those who are managing or struggling are fairly balanced when it comes to food and drink servings chosen for health. On the right side, this is broken down into categories within some of those health need states. We see a similar pattern here again. Those who are more comfortable with their finances can prioritise those food choices for health, whilst those who are managing or struggling are more likely to cut back in line with their budgets. Next slide, please. This chart presents the total percentage of people reducing their meat consumption tracked over time. Prior to the COVID pandemic, meat reduction had grown substantially, rising to 30% of people at its height. However, when lockdown first hit, this figure declined massively. This was a time when people really valued that enjoyability and comfort which meat provided. It also saw a decline in negative media as COVID took centre stage across all platforms. In the past 12 months, we have seen meat reduction steadily creep back up on people's agendas, and we can see what is driving this further on the next slide. So here we can see the different reasons for meat reduction over time. Since COVID, we had seen reasons for meat reduction levels return to pre-pandemic levels. But since May 2022, this has quickly been overtaken by meat becoming too expensive, the blue line, as the leading reason for meat reduction, increasing 17 percentage points since the last tracker survey. It's important to note here that people haven't reduced their meat consumption because they actively want to, as they would have done so if they were reducing for those reputational reasons such as health, the environment, or animal welfare. This is very much a decision which has been taken away from them as the cost of living pressure intensifies. Next slide, please. We do see a different story for dairy. Reputational reasons still outweigh cost as the main reasons for thinking about cutting back on dairy, with 57% of consumers identifying health as the main reason, a 5% decline from last year. However, we have seen a 20 percentage point increase year on year for cost. So this is something going up on consumers' priorities, and we are yet to see if this trend continues. Certain dairy products do have that more reasonable price point and are generally more of a staple item in the home. So it's important to remind customers of the strong, filling health credentials that dairy can provide. Next slide, please. At a total level, 55% of British adults feel food shopping is not very or not at all affordable. This feeling is evident across many demographics. Although families with children and those in lower socioeconomic households are more likely to find the prices completely unaffordable. Next slide, please. In the month of August, we did see meat consumption drop to a 5-year low. Meat is an important part of many meals, but as evening meals with meat are considerably more expensive than those without, we could see meat being one of the ingredients dropped from dishes, particularly for those with children and less affluent households who are struggling to afford food. Next slide, please. Many consumers are starting to feel they must reduce meat and dairy consumption to save money, but both play an important role in a balanced diet and have strong health credentials to back this up. So it's necessary going forwards to give customers that assurance so that they can make those healthier choices and ensure they continue to include good quality protein and micronutrients such as iron and B12 in their diet. Now I'll hand over to Susie again, who's going to talk about whether consumers are less environmentally conscious. Thank you.
Thanks, Cathy. So in 2021, with COP26 being held in the UK, environment was really displacing COVID as the #1 cause for concern, with concerns around greenhouse gases and methane kind of ranking with plastics as the top. But what has happened now, and are consumers being forced to make compromises in ethics here too, as well as with health? So despite the extreme weather conditions that were seen this year, consumers' eyes have been elsewhere. Even as wildfires burned, the key focus was really on the news around the cost of living and the political leadership of the UK bouncing from one crisis to the next. As we can see here, this is some data from IGD looking at how consumers prioritise affordability versus sustainability. And you can see here that the two metrics are increasingly becoming polarised, and consumers are increasingly being forced to choose factors such as price over environmental sustainability. And as is typical with consumers, they like to feel that they're doing the right thing. They like to, buy the green thing. They like to, try and buy higher welfare produce, etc., but not at any price. And you can see here, people are having to prioritise other factors. Kantar run a segmentation, and this comes from their Who Cares Who Does study, and the segmentation breaks out consumers in terms of their sustainability consciousness, if you like. Over the past couple of years, we've seen that the number of the most eco-engaged, the eco-actives group, has declined for the first time. Now, this isn't declining by huge amounts at the moment, but you can see from this that the pressures are already causing lower engagement with environmental issues, and that's likely to continue over time. And this also feeds through to specific concerns that consumers have about farming's sustainability credentials. So you can see here that the numbers feeling that farming has a positive impact on the environment in the UK has risen a little. So like last year, vegetarians and vegans drive the negative outlook. They're almost twice as likely than others to have a negative view on the impact of farming on the environment. But by and large, the majority of people in the UK are feeling fairly positive there. At the same time, however, we see some very slight softening in worries around issues such as plastics and global warming that could be indicative of other priorities such as cost taking centre stage. But you can see here, and this is looking at dairy farming as an example, and people feeling that dairy farming is good for the countryside. You can see here that the longer term direction of travel on environmental concern has been clear. So 5 years ago, 2/3 of people thought that dairy farming was good for the countryside. That figure has been steadily eroding over time. As you can see, it's been a gradual change, but it's been kind of relentless. But this year we've seen a bit of an uplift. Rightly so, there has been lots of positive progress made in terms of the dairy roadmap and other initiatives. However, the longer term trend is clear, and the majority of people do still feel that they do consider the environmental impact of the food that they eat. Although the dominant considerations here are plastics and food waste, the urge to limit food waste in particular has both an environmental and an economic benefit for consumers, of course, so we would expect to see that as a driver kind of growing over time. But there is still a whole host of specific environmental concerns around farming that have not changed, even though the issues are less front of mind for consumers. The conclusion has to be that concern for the environment is highly likely to rebound in future. So efforts towards net zero and other environmental initiatives on farms still need to be a priority right the way through the supply chain, or we could find that some awkward questions will be asked when consumers do start to feel less financially strained again. But given how all this change in societal concerns has gone on, how has this impacted upon trust in British agriculture? We know that trust is vital, and we know what a vital role farmers themselves can play in delivering that trust. We wanted to understand, is this still the case, or have events overtaken? In a study that we run with research agency Blue Marble on an annual basis, looking at overall impressions of British agriculture, you can see here that consumers remain pretty stable in terms of their opinions. 61% feel very or somewhat positive towards British agriculture. So overall, pretty positive despite some of what we might see in the media. We saw a bit of an outlier year in 2020 when the pandemic was raging. And at that point, consumers were really grateful for the efforts of farmers and for the efforts of other parts of the food supply chain to actually keep them fed and to keep the economy moving. But since then, things have kind of returned to normal. So overall, picture of stability over time. You may note, however, over time there's been a slight increase in negativity at the bottom of the scale. So you can see there 8% of people feeling somewhat or very negative. Now, if we compare that back to when the study began in 2019, that figure was at 5%. So some slight shifts over time. Again, they are very slight, but it's kind of worth bearing that in mind, and we're going to return more to why that might be the case. Generally, people are more positive towards agriculture or towards British agriculture if they're older, if they're kind of more comfortable, less financially pressured, and also for those who are better informed about the food system. We can break that down by sector as well, so we get a sense of what's going on amongst the different farming sectors. Typically, people are generally more positive about crop sectors than animal, but even within animal, people are fairly even across the ruminants. So if you look at dairy farming, sheep farming and beef farming, overall it's a pretty positive picture. These haven't really changed over time, so I've just charted a point in time. So this is looking at data from 2022. However, when I bring in the pig and poultry sectors, I have charted this over time, just so you can see the picture. Now, I think the issue for consumers with pig and poultry farming is that consumers typically associate them with more intensive production systems. And because of that, you generally see a bit more negativity, the red at the bottom of the scale. And you can see that for both pig and poultry production is a bit of an uplift. Again, it's steady, but it has been a gradual uplift over time. And I think that's been really driven by effects of a lot of the negative news in the media that there has been over the last year. We know there's been some fairly huge production challenges for both the pig sector, particularly the pig sector, but also in the poultry sector. So for the pig sector, there's been a lot of negative press around, the challenges around getting enough CO2 and labour challenges, build-up of pigs on farm and availability in abattoirs, and a whole host of other challenges that have made the news this year. And for chicken, a number of retailers have been, and other food service operators have been running a better chicken initiative, which serves to highlight areas for improvement for consumers. But even when we look at these more intensive sectors, there is much more positivity than there is negativity. So some positives to take away there. If we look at trust in the supply chain generally and look at who is driving that trust, as we've seen previously, farmers are by far the most trusted part of the supply chain, head and shoulders above the other groups, and that's been consistently the case over the past few years. What we're starting to see is that other parts of the supply chain, such as retailers, food processors and food service, excuse me, are starting to encounter a little bit less positivity from consumers as consumers encounter higher prices, which kind of feeds through towards attitudes. However, farmers are not seeing that same impact. But what drives that trust for farmers? We wanted to explore more here. So if we dig under the skin of trust and take farmers as trustworthy as a metric, what we've done here, and sorry to get a little bit technical, but we've run a key drivers analysis, which is a multiple regression analysis that helps us to understand underlying drivers of trust. So what is most strongly statistically linked to the trust of farmers? And that goes beyond what people might say is important, which might be more skewed by the more top of mind issues. I think some of the interesting findings here are that trust can be driven in two ways. So one of which is farmer performance factors. So there's a real feeling that farmers do things well, such as care for people, animals and the planet, and have a strong sense of expertise, and we've seen that in the past. But there's also coming through a kind of second area, which is more around farmer respect, and that is people who have an understanding of where food comes from, people who believe that excuse me, farming provides safe and affordable food, and feeling that farmers should receive fair prices. So sorry. There is a real sense that consumers are sympathetic towards farmers, that they're receivers of rising prices, not causes of it, and that they should receive fair prices. So there's a feeling that farmers, along with the rest of society, are kind of all in the same boat, that we are all suffering with different struggles, particularly with a rising cost of living, and that they also accept and believe that there is a real risk of food security coming through. And so there is a sense as well that people do believe that British farmers and growers are doing a good job in producing food. And also half of people agree that they would want to proactively look for British food and produce over imported foods. So there is some opportunity there. As you might expect, however, there will be pressures on consumers and they will be changing some of their buying behaviours. And now we explored this in more depth in webinar 1. But for particularly, there are things that people feel they'll be doing less due to the cost of living. So choosing premium brands of food, for example, and buying organic food as something that people feel that they'll be buying less of. However, if people feel that they can be ethical and save money at the same time, that's a win-win. So if they can buy food that helps them to make better use of leftovers, that saves money and reduces waste. Buying food loose, for example, which is something that people feel they'll be doing more of, saves money and also gives less plastic. So there's an opportunity here in that there is still a desire to choose British food rather than imported. So I think the opportunity here is to frame British as local, rather than buying British for kind of patriotic reasons. It's more about localness for some consumers. So there may be perceived price efficiencies for them because there's lower food miles, as well as the kind of environmental and patriotic reasons. Interestingly, when you look at what people feel they'll do more and less of, free range and animal welfare considerations are a bit more split. So some people feeling they'll buy less, some people still holding to their guns and feeling they'll buy more. So there's still a real role to play here for kind of higher welfare produce. Interestingly, also from the Cantor's Who Cares Who Does research that looks at the ethical shopper, they found that British shoppers in particular were actually more motivated by animal welfare claims on pack than the global average, but they were less motivated by a local produce claim, again showing that in the UK, slapping a British flag on it is not enough. So British shoppers need to really understand what brand Britain offers them in terms of animal welfare, in terms of sustainability, and in terms of great taste. If we take pork as an example here, on welfare, you can see that certain higher welfare products have found a bit of a niche. Although products with a welfare claim are much smaller in the pig sector and it's significantly more expensive, since 2019 we've seen that high welfare pork products have grown faster. So they've gone up by 10% in terms of volume versus stability for standard. So why is that, considering the cost constraints? These outdoor claims that are typically found on pork products are more likely to be found on processed pig meat products, which account for 18% of sausage volumes and 13% of bacon. And we know that price promotions are more common in these sorts of categories than in primary protein, making outdoor claims more accessible to shoppers, as on average they command a 63% price premium over standard products. But this year there has been less promotional activity as retailers have moved to an everyday low pricing strategy. So as the cost of living challenges hit, higher welfare has been more in line with a wider market in terms of performance, with volumes very much in line, so 7% versus -7% versus -6.8% for standard. In terms of how people want to understand more about different production systems and about sustainability and other methods of production, typically labelling remains a key way for consumers to feel informed about product credentials. There is a clear demand here for more labelling, and we know this is something that's being explored by DEFRA, who are conducting a bit of a review of welfare labelling and how that might look going forwards. But also sustainability labelling, where IGD are trialling a new system looking at sustainability labelling. There are a number of challenges with this, not least the technical challenges of how we measure these things, how we understand the impact of one product versus another, a whole host of different challenges, which is beyond the scope of this webinar. However, it does show that there is clear demand for consumers to know more. Interestingly, people feeling that they would find QR codes useful is at the highest levels we've ever seen since we've been running this study, which just shows how comfortable people have been finding QR codes as a method for delivering that information. As part of the trust research, we also looked at the role that mass media channels, such as Netflix and Amazon Prime, can have in affecting consumer attitudes, both positively and negatively. We've all seen or heard about some of these different documentaries. Clarkson's Farm in particular has had a massive impact in terms of people seeing and hearing and thinking more about farming as a result. And if people have seen Clarkson's Farm, that's helped them to have a more positive view on British agriculture, so 68% versus 57%, and it's also helped to grow trust in farmers as well, interestingly. On the negative side, some of the documentaries that are out there, such as Seaspiracy, Cowspiracy, Game Changers and so on, can have the converse effect. So if people have seen those sorts of documentaries, they have a more negative view on British agriculture and feel, or they're less likely to agree that farmers are trustworthy. I just wanted to finish up just by talking about Gen Z, and Gen Z in this sense is defined as kind of the younger generation, the generation that came after the millennials. So those who are typically in their sort of late teens or in their teens and early 20s now. They're an extremely media savvy group. It's vital to understand Gen Z and how they're approaching things, because they're a very different group to wider society, and we really need to change our approach when we're thinking about Gen Z. Gen Z as a whole are less engaged with farmers than other generations, and they're a bit less positive towards farmers and British agriculture today than others. So if we just look at some of this data in terms of attitudes towards farmers, so they're 10% percentage points less likely to believe that to be positive towards British agriculture, and they're a bit less likely to find farmers trustworthy. And some of the key differences are in how Gen Z are influenced. So how they consume media is very different to the older generation. So as you might expect, they're much higher users of social media, of online search, and that really kind of influence their food choices. And different influencers, such as personal trainers, are more influential to them, and bloggers. And they're much more likely to have watched some of those sort of negative documentaries, so more likely to have seen Game Changers, Seaspiracy, Cowspiracy, and so on. And the key driver analysis that we ran as well suggests for that youngest age group, they feel less, or for them, that feeling well informed about the food system is more strongly linked to their trust of farmers. So it makes the engagement that we have with that group with appropriate content through the right channels is absolutely crucial. And when we talk about the right channels, well, what do we mean? As we know, Gen Z are much more strongly influenced by social media, but the type of social media that they engage with is quite different to wider society. And actually channels such as TikTok, much more influential, and Snapchat, as well as online forums, and they're less engaged with sort of more traditional social media such as Facebook. So just something to think about when we're going to be engaging with them, and I know that's something that Carrie's going to pick up on in her presentation. So just to finalise my section, just with some thoughts for the future. So the landscape in terms of reputation has changed to one which is increasingly price sensitive, but consumers are still ethically aware. And although reputational factors are not currently top priority, they are bubbling under the surface. We still need to be cognizant of them, and we still need to prioritise them in the work that we're doing. The value equation needs to be right as well. It's not all about price all of the time. There is an opportunity for British produce if we can really also frame it as local sustainability, having higher standards, or having the best taste. In terms of health needs are adapting and becoming more streamlined. Many consumers are having to adopt a cheaper, more nutrient-poor diet. That's a real challenge for society. They may start to prioritise simple needs like low fat rather than more positive needs such as containing fruits and vegetables or having enough kind of lean, high-quality protein. There's a real opportunity here to showcase the important role that meat and dairy can and should play in a healthy, balanced diet. And now I'm going to hand over to Carrie, who's going to talk about some of the things that AHDB are doing to support some of these challenges.
Good morning. So I'm Carrie McDermott, I'm Head of Marketing, and I'm going to cover how AHDB are working hard to positively influence consumer attitudes to meat and dairy, and how we can work together as an industry to build a more sustainable future. Next slide, please. So in marketing, our role is to deliver value for the levy payer. So we work hand in hand with our market insights team to build, develop, and importantly, evaluate campaigns. And we always start with the consumer. By understanding what is resonating in their world, we can focus our messaging to best promote meat and dairy. So in response to the cost of living crisis, we've pivoted some of our activity to focus on affordability in our Feed the Family for Less Pork campaign, which launched this Monday. And we also have always on content on social media, supporting value for money and affordability for beef, lamb and dairy. However, AHDB are also uniquely placed to help promote the long-term sustainable future of our categories and positively influence consumer attitudes in the area of reputation, namely health, standards and sustainability. Next slide, please. So for those of you who caught the webinar last week, my colleague Nick covered off our work on affordability. So I'm not going to major on this activity. However, here's a quick flavour, no pun intended. So affordability and value for money has been key to our social media messaging recently. So we're keen to promote milk as an affordable but also a highly nutritious choice. And for beef and lamb, we've been posting consumer hacks and freezing tips to help meals and budgets stretch further. And for lamb, we've encouraged consumers to treat themselves at home with Takeaway Fridays. We also launched our Feed the Family for Less campaign, creating recipes for under £5. And we showcase how pulled pork can be used once, cooked once, used twice to feed a hungry family. As Cathy highlighted early, families are really feeling the pinch at the moment, so we've really targeted our messaging for pork towards them. Next slide, please. We also have our We Eat Balanced campaign, which launched on the 7th of September, and this is to protect long-term attitudes to British meat and dairy. And that's really about us being bold, leading the conversation and arming consumers with some of those facts about meat and dairy. Next slide, please. Meat and dairy really need to think beyond taste and enjoyment. So we've identified 3 proof points which really resonated in consumers when we did our consumer research. So health, and specifically B12, provides a unique selling point for meat and dairy, and our ambition is to establish B12 in the same way fish is synonymous with omega-3. Sustainability is important to consumers in the industry, and we should differentiate to consumers that British meat and dairy is amongst the most sustainable in the world, and also celebrate our world-class food and farming standards. Next slide, please. So here's a snapshot of some of our activity that went live, and will be back on TV also in January. So that included video on demand, social media, print advertising and retail activity, including over 1 million stickers on packs within retailers with a link to healthy recipes. Next slide, please. And speaking to the next generation of meat and dairy consumers is really important to us. And as Susie said, how these younger consumers consume media is quite different to older generations, and social media is really key here. So we've developed new guessing games, and we know from consumer research that the younger consumers said they couldn't resist a poll. So these are currently live on social media, and we're also working with influencers for our January campaigns to promote positive messaging to consumers while they're on those platforms. Next slide, please. So we aim to provide a positive drumbeat of messaging in our always on social media. And we use our We Eat Balanced channel to hero positive case studies of farmers. And as Susie said, farmers are the most trusted part of the supply chain, and we want to kind of shine a light on positive stories. So please follow us on social media and like and share that content. Next slide, please. So you can also help us tell farming's story. So please provide any case studies that you have that can help us tell a compelling story for meat and dairy. Next slide, please. So what are the next steps for marketing? So we'll continue with our drumbeat of positive messaging on sustainability and health, while in the short term we also pivot our messaging to focus on value for money and affordability. We're also seeking to improve the meat shopping experience long-term in supermarkets, and thank you to the processors and retailers on the call who have collaborated and been partners in that journey. And we're back on TV and social media in January, giving meat and dairy industry a positive voice. And that's all from me.
Thank you very much to our speakers today for those great presentations. Special thank you to Susie, as I know she's not feeling particularly well, so well done for getting through the coughs there. But it's a lot to cover in a short space of time, so some great insights there. So before moving on to the Q&A, I just wanted to remind you that the 2 webinar recordings will be available on our website, so you can share those with people. And to be kept up to date with what the Retail and Consumer Insight team are working on and publishing, please sign up to our bi-monthly newsletter via our website. Finally, a reminder to fill in the feedback form if you would like a PDF copy of the slides that you have seen today. So I'm now going to move on to the questions. So if I can ask everyone if they can turn their cameras back on. And just to flag, don't worry if we don't get to your question, we'll be answering them via email afterwards. So I'll be going through the questions now. We've had a few come through while you were talking. So Susie, there was one that I wanted to pass on to you, which is about, is there any evidence that animal rights activism such as Animal Rebellion and the Animal Justice Project, both of whom engage with Gen Z, are impacting on trust in farming and consumer purchasing habits?
Thanks, Kim. I think younger people are more engaged with those groups, and they will be more likely to kind of follow those sorts of groups on social media. However, I do think that the sorts of activities that Animal Rebellion have been carrying out in the last couple of weeks have been probably not great for their cause, shall we say. So I don't know if you've seen that activity, but they've been going into supermarkets and literally pouring milk all over the floor, showing total disregard for the people who work in those stores, actually actively wasting food at a time when shoppers are really struggling and feeling the pinch. And I think what we've seen in social media when people have been talking is people feel quite negative about the way that they're going about things. I think people agree that people should be able to express their opinions, but there's ways of doing things, and wasting food in the midst of cost of living crisis is just beyond the pale, really.
Yeah, agree. Great, thank you, Susie. Carrie, we've had some positive comments about the Wheat Balance campaign, so everyone really liking that. And we have had a question about how are you planning to measure success of the campaign?
Yeah, good question. So evaluation is really key, and we work with Kim and Susie and Cathy to help evaluate those campaigns, and also with independent businesses. So they will track before we go live with campaigns. They'll look at consumer attitudes, and then post the campaign, we'll also quantify and analyse them again, so we can see positive shifts. And the ultimate aim is over months and years that we positively begin to build the reputation of meat and dairy, and also counterbalance some of the negativity that we see in the press.
Great, thank you, Carrie. Susie, we've had a question come in about trust, and specifically you mentioned supermarkets in the presentation. Has there been any research on trust of independents, so for example butchers, versus these bigger supermarkets?
It's a really interesting question. We don't cover trust in independents specifically within the Blue Marble study. However, I have seen some data from other studies which shows that actually trust in butchers and other independent retailers tends to be a lot higher than in supermarkets. And I think there's probably some real opportunities for butchers during this time. Although consumers may perceive them to be more expensive and a bit less convenient, which might hold them back in some ways, they've also got a real expertise so that they can help consumers to make the most of their budget. So they may be able to post them towards cheaper cuts, for example, and explain how they might go about cooking some of those and give them different ideas. And there's also real flexibility with a butcher in that you can go into a butcher and you can ask for sort of 300 grams of meat if that's all you need, rather than in the supermarket it might be kind of have to have fixed pack sizes. So there are opportunities there, and I think if you can leverage that trust, that's sort of a great thing to do. But it will be vital to kind of get people through the door, and the butchers and the independents might need to take a few strings from the supermarket bows there, a loyalty scheme, for example, or a system of stamps could be really kind of helpful to get people re-engaged with the butchers again. And we know during COVID, butcher sales just went up massively because they were really helping British shoppers through a crisis. We're coming into a crisis again, so it's kind of like, your country needs you butchers, what can you do to help?
Yeah, Great, thank you, Susie. We've had a question come in which yeah, anyone can answer really, and there might be a couple of points of view. So it's great that we've seen such positivity about UK farmers. Should we be worried about the small group of people who have those negative views, which Susie may want to answer, and then what are AHDB doing to address this? There might be a marketing point of view there, although we have obviously seen the great work that the marketing team are doing post this question coming in, so we've kind of answered it, but if there's anything you want to build on it.
Okay, I think if I take it first, I think it's important to note that negativity, yes, it's there and it's increased slightly, but it's still at really low levels. So we need to kind of keep that in context. And it's unsurprising when there's a load of kind of negative supply chain challenges that will sort of leak through to consumers. And the hope would be that some of those would improve going forwards. But I'm really going to hand over to Carrie, because I think the work that Carrie and the team are doing is absolutely how we will manage some of that negativity. So over to Carrie.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and we were actually in research groups with consumers till late last night, hearing about how they want us to talk about meat and dairy, and they were saying very much to keep it very positive. And I think, you know, let's celebrate the standards that we have. We have world-class leading standards, and we're amongst the most sustainable in the world. And the way consumers are saying they want us to talk to them is to really celebrate that, focus on the positive. And I think by having that voice, we'll kind of try and drown out some of that negativity that comes from smaller groups.
Yeah, agree. And probably just to add to that, as well as the marketing, the retail and consumer insight team work very closely with the press team, where we kind of put out a lot of articles and information to kind of counterbalance that argument, to make sure that our factual information is getting out there as well, so that people can see both sides, both sides of the argument. So we have a question come in about are universities with agriculture, vet-related courses covering the negative misconceptions of agriculture and correcting these false understandings? I suppose with that one, it's important to note that we work and we do presentations and conferences and stuff at universities to vets, etc. So we are getting our information out there to people. Was there anything else you wanted to add to that one, Susie?
No, not in particular. I think it's just important that we continue to try to engage with kind of all groups, and you know, provide evidence, because we are an evidence-based organisation, and to give people kind of the tools they need to make the right decisions. We're actually approached by university students on pretty much monthly basis for help with dissertations and so on and so forth. So that, you know, there are a lot of people out there who want better information. So it's we're quite open source with a lot of the information that we have out there. So you can look at our retail dashboards, for example, which will give you the latest sales for meat and dairy and so on. And a lot of people can access that information. So yeah, that's where I'll be.
Perfect. Well, I think that's probably a good place to finish, and a good plug for our website there, Susie, to end with. So please, yeah, everyone, have a look at that. Because I did promise that you'd have 5 minutes back at the end before I'm sure you will move on to your next meeting. So any unanswered questions, we will contact you via email. And as I've said, please fill in the feedback form that should pop up once this session finishes, if you would like a copy of the slides. So thank you for the speakers today, and also thank you everyone for attending today's session.